I have to say I have a personal reason for very much liking to visit Iceland for the first time. I lived for a long time in a tropical area, and I am a cold weather person, so I hated that very much. And the way I stayed sane was by reading Norse sagas. These images of people on glaciers made me very happy and comfortable. So I have a very warm and pleasant vision of Iceland, and I was gratified to have that appear in reality. What I would like to speak about for the next 20 minutes is how we can connect education to sustainability. And I'd like to use the metaphor of settlement, partly because I'm in the city of Reykjavik. But also I'd like you to think more broadly about how to transform education, because I think the stakes are quite high. I would also like to thank the previous speakers who have been showing us many ways forward. They've been giving us metrics, definitions, policies, and concepts. However, I would like to begin on a slightly darker or more cloudy note and say that in many ways we don't know where we're going and the path is quite challenging. I'd like to begin by asserting that we are not sustainable now, and we will not be sustainable for the near future and possibly the medium-term future. Last week, we passed another milestone. The Hawaiian Observatory, that is probably our best source for analyzing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, realized that the CO2 level reached 400 parts per million. A friend of mine 10 years ago launched an organization called 350.org. I don't know if you know it. Bill McKibben wanted us to take 350 as the limit. That was as far as we would go. No more than 350. We could hold it to that, and we wouldn't go any further. That was a failure. We've now reached 400 parts per million with no signs of slowing down. And thanks to the way the physics works in the atmosphere, that 400 parts per million will be there for a long, long time. On top of that, I probably don't need to say much about how politics are not exactly making us more sustainable at the moment. I won't sing the lyrics to this song and the image here, but you get the idea. We have political dysfunction. We have political unrest that play out internationally in multiple different forms. We are watching our managing elites fail and stagger in many, many ways. And we also see popular resentment of elites in ways that I haven't experienced for decades. When these forces combine, the outcome may be a vicious cycle. That is, if we have environmental stresses triggering political unrest, and you could think about climate migrants already happening, either directly or indirectly, political unrest, which meets a leadership which is at best tottering, and then that results in distrust and friction, which then escalates, and then these repeat and these reiterate into a vicious cycle. This is not a good direction to be heading in. A novelist and futurist named Bruce Sterling offers this powerful vision of the future. He says, the middle of the 20th century, from here up to about 2070 or 2075, it's old people in big cities afraid of the sky. Bruce Sterling's an environmentalist. In the 1990s, he led a campaign called the Viridian Movement to try to make environmental causes more appealing and more exciting. That didn't work out. And now we may be heading to Bruce Sterling's future of old people in big cities afraid of the sky. The technologies we're using give us many, many extraordinary benefits, but they are massively not sustainable. Computer production, computer disposal is expensive, carbon-rich, and messy at best, if not environmentally dangerous at worst. They rely heavily on rare earths, which are dangerous to their environment often, dangerous to work with, and they are not plentiful. They're becoming a source of international competition and skullduggery. We are, in short, very, very far from the circular economy. Green computing is a thing. It has a long way to go. So what can we do? This conference has been touching on many, many methods, many approaches, and I admire them all. I want to speak now about how education can respond to this. Education is not a silver bullet that you use to kill a werewolf. Education is just one part of the civic environment, but we should focus on it. And I'd like to offer 5 steps that we can take. And again, this involves resettling education. The first is changing the curriculum and changing the pedagogy of how we teach. The second is embracing new literacies. The third is to make democratically engaged education. The fourth is to commit to openness. And the fifth is to consider schools as sites for sustainability. Let me explain each of these, and then I would love to hear your questions. To begin with, think about a curriculum for sustainability. This is more complex than it sounds. It's pretty easy to write a textbook or put up a blog page that says, here's how we can be sustainable. We have metrics, as the previous speaker just showed us. We have centuries, actually, of practice and thinking. What's hard is thinking about infusing this across education, from primary school through universities and professional programs. That has to involve ecological thinking. That has to involve systems thinking. And systems thinking, as we know, is difficult. Humans are not good at that naturally. They take a lot of training. This also has to be interdisciplinary. And by interdisciplinary, I don't mean English and European literature. I don't mean chemistry and physics. I mean, we have to think about sociology, psychology, physics, meteorology, and political science to begin with. And that interdisciplinarity has to be serious. It has to involve the powers of each discipline, so that students have to understand geology as well as psychology in order to bring them together, to see how humans respond to the environment and how humans work together. We also have to heed the lesson of biophilia, that the curriculum, the pedagogy has to embrace creativity and play. It is too easy for educators and academics to be dead serious. When we look at gaming, we think, oh, that's great for kids. Not for us. We're serious academics. We don't have fun. Fun is for other people. This is totally wrong. This is terrible pedagogically. This is the death of the spirit, and this kills learning. We know that people learn by playing. And by people, I don't just mean children. I mean adults of all ages. We have to embrace the spirit of fun and creativity, even in the face of horrors and terrible, terrible, nearly apocalyptic stresses. We have to hold on to that spirit of play and delight. We also have to teach and reteach soft skills. Collaboration is something we believe in. Globally, every country I've been to has embraced collaboration as an idea, and it's still hard to do. We're not very good at it. A casual look at the Panama Papers shows us that we are good at collaborating on bad causes. We are excellent at corruption. We are terrific at inefficiency, not so good at collaborating on, say, creativity or saving the world. We also have to teach participatory citizenship. And I'm going to come back to this several times because this is harder and much more dangerous than it sounds. That is, we have to actually believe in democracy. I am delighted to be speaking about this in Iceland, the home of what in many ways is the West's greatest and oldest democracy, to think about the all thing. We need to embrace this when we think about ecosystems. On Twitter a few minutes ago, I asked a little barbed question of what does management of the green economy mean? It's very curious to see how management could play out. Do we have a benign dictatorship? Do we have an Orwellian or a Huxleyan form of organization that's authoritarian? Or do we have something that is democratic? I believe if we're going to involve education in this, it has to be democratic. And that includes living online. That includes teaching people not just how to be good citizens in their city or in their town, but how to be good citizens of the world. Because if you put up a blog post about an awesome Icelandic death metal band, you may have interactions with Japan and New Jersey. How do you do that? How do you actually speak to people you've never met, who probably don't speak your language, who have a totally different politics? How do you communicate with each other? As adults, we're not great at this. Schools, education have to teach us to do this. And we have to do this inclusively. The previous speaker emphasized this a couple of times. We have to bring in everybody. We are in an age of division. We are in an age of identification and in an age of surveillance. We have to be inclusive. Now, the thing about democracy is that once it gets rolling, it can be very contagious. It can impact all kinds of information and go beyond information. If we think about democracy, really, it changes spaces. So a classroom becomes a different space when students can ask questions and challenge the teacher. Libraries become different spaces when the patrons can add to the collections. Civic areas become different spaces when they are not necessarily completely controlled. And thinking about democracy, if you let students be democratic, it makes it harder for them it makes them harder to manage. It might be insurgent. This is something that American foreign policy keeps running into, where it tries to impose democracy on places and then doesn't like what they do with their elections. If you give people democratic powers, they might not do what you like. This is a challenge for everybody. And this can happen in the classroom, in the community, and it can happen about policy. Iceland crowdsourced a constitution, which I just love still thinking about. That's a wonderful innovation. If we can democratize policy, then we have to educate people to be able to do this effectively. Now, one way of thinking about this is as a new form of literacy, which some of us call digital literacy. And there is no definition that everyone agrees upon. We can spend an hour hashing that out. I won't do that to you because I like you. It includes a series of ideas. You can find infographics of all kinds, thinking about everything from technical skills to e-safety to collaboration. But let me just give you 3 forms to think about. One is media literacy. And back in the 60s and 70s, the idea of media literacy was teaching people to be skeptical consumers of information. So if you read a magazine, you watch a television program, you see a movie, you hear a speech, you should be skeptical and critical and not just take it as given. And there are a lot of exercises for this. With new media, we have to be extra aware of this. My friend Howard Rheingold says we have to have a crap detector built in, so that when you get a blog post or someone forwards you a Facebook article, you shouldn't just accept it as a real thing. You have to be skeptical and critical. That's one piece. A second piece is what I call basic production. How many of you were born before 1990? Quick show of hands. Okay. How many of you were born before 1970? Okay. So most of the people in this room were trained in a media environment that no longer applies. We were trained to watch television very nicely. I grew up with an awful lot of choices. I had 6 channels to choose from. We were trained to watch movies in theaters quietly. We were taught to read newspapers and books that were given to us, to accept what librarians were given to us. We were passive. That was the way the 20th century media reached its apogee. That no longer works anymore. We now have participatory media. We now contribute to it as well as consume it. And that means we have to teach students a literacy of production. Students need to be able to know how to make PowerPoint presentations, Word documents, audio documents, perhaps video. In fact, at a basic production level, we have a lot to learn, and not everybody here has that basic level of literacy. We can also think about an advanced level, where students make, say, videos, but they also make programs. Perhaps the best way of thinking about literacy is teaching everybody to code, at least the basic idea, to give them a glancing familiarity with coding. This, for example, is a little computer program written by children, using a program called Scratch, which I recommend strongly. The only downside of Scratch is that it has one built-in sound effect, which is a cat going meow, which is a lot of fun, except when you have a dog around, and then the dogs panic. Where is this cat? Where can it be? Oh, somewhere around here, coming from the computer. Watch out when you have that happen. But we can teach people how to code. If we can teach 4th graders how to code, we can teach even adult academics. This means thinking as well about how computers think, what we call computational thinking. And this is different. This comes back to systems thinking, but another way. For example, one research project says that computational thinking means creating and making use of different levels of abstraction to understand and solve problems more effectively. So if you want to manage a room full of people, to think about them as a computer would, to think about how they'll be processed by algorithm. I don't mean that's the best way to proceed, but this is the way the world works. And we should connect this with positive student work. Let me just give you one long quote. Education should not be merely about learning how to consume. Education should be about becoming an active participant in the major communication functions of society. Just as we not only teach students to read, but we also teach them how to write, how to assemble their writings into forms that others will want to read, how to speak publicly. In a digital age, we need to teach our students how to author and distribute digital works. Digital literacy is a productive literacy. And one of the best ways of teaching this and practicing it is with storytelling. To teach students to use digital tools to make stories. I'm a humanist. I hate to assert universals, but there is one. Every society, every culture I've ever seen or heard of, even people from New Jersey, love storytelling. They love to make stories, they love to tell stories, and above all, they love to consume stories. When I mention stories to an adult audience, it's fun to watch people's shoulders. If I'm talking about technology, they're like this. Then I say story, everyone relaxes. It's almost as though they're mentally sitting down for me to tell them the story. But the great thing about storytelling, about making stories, is that it has cognitive and pedagogical powers. If a student makes a story, they have to integrate different sources. They have to integrate what they've been taught, what they've been reading and seeing, along with the tools of making a story, whatever they are. Of voice, of character, of PowerPoint, of video. They have to integrate all of that, which is terrific. They have to be creative, because they're actually making something, which may be fiction or nonfiction or a blend. They're making something. And especially powerful for students who would be democratic, they have to realize their voice. Literally at times. They get to hear themselves speak, but they discover who they are in the act of making. What a wonderful, essential development for people. These literacies have to be thinking of the future, by the way. We can't think just about literacies of the past. We have to include what the future is bringing us. Here are two science fiction ideas that were blazingly, excitingly weird and are now kind of traditional. One is 3D printing. The woman on the right there, on your left, is part of a project that is making prosthetics, artificial hands for people who have lost their fingers or entire hands due to disease or injury. She's a student. The students are doing this. They're improving people's lives. She's making things. Literacies have to account for that. And on the right is a little artificial intelligence who you can speak to, who can help you do things. Is your model of literacy, is your model of teaching accounting for that? You should embrace open. By open, I mean open education resources. So I don't mean something that you have to pay for or download or only access streaming. I mean something that you can download yourself for free and share with people and edit. I also mean open scholarship, taking books, articles, and other media, and making sure they're freely available for anybody to use. I was visiting North African libraries, and I found one of the interesting things. They were crowded with people at all hours, but their shelves were relatively empty for historical reasons, and economic reasons. They would love to have access to the developed world scholarly publication, to our sciences, our humanities. It's in many ways our responsibility to make that happen. And open teaching. Oftentimes we go into a classroom, we close the door. I'm like here right now. If we didn't have Twitter, if we didn't have this wonderful videographer, hello, this would be a kind of black box. This would be a closed space, a private space, which has advantages. But imagine sharing this with the world. I mean, some of you are Twittering right now, which is excellent. Imagine taking this material and making sure everybody could see it at primary school, at secondary school. There are wonderful reasons for doing this. One of them is inclusion. You get to increase access to things, but also creativity. You get to show what you're doing that puts you on stage. You might do something different. And then you get to learn from other people being open. You can connect your schools to the world at large. What a mind-blowing experience for a 7-year-old to enter a classroom knowing they could be talking to kids from Australia or from Egypt or from Paraguay. It's also a professional development strategy, because if you embrace open and you behave in an open way, it's a virtuous circle. So for example, you can find lots of charts like this. On the left side there, if you start opening up with technology, with learning activities, learning objectives, you get to start, as you can see on the right, conversations about this. You can ask, how did this learning plan work? How did this lesson go? Get feedback, learn about practices, share them, discover more, learn more, and then that feeds into what you do. It becomes a virtuous circle of improvement. I mean, open is a kind of no-brainer when you think about it. But what about our schools themselves? We go back to the ground. We think about classrooms, libraries, locker rooms, gyms, cafeterias. How can we make them sustainable? I don't have enough time to go into the meticulous details of this. I would love to talk about composting in schools, which is very, very important. I would love to talk about the materials of, say, walls or textbooks. But let me say a few words at strategic level. Think about schools in terms of their environmental impact and location, and have schools do that themselves. Think about their roofs, for example. How much sunlight they get. Can they grow plants on their roofs? Can they put turbines on their roofs? How about gardening elsewhere? How about the heat impact? How much heat does it radiate? How much heat does it pick up? And so on. Analyze the school as an environmental issue. At this conference, we've had many matrices and metrics and methods for approaching that. Have students think about that. Imagine having a 13-year-old wonder, what does my school do to the green economy? How does it contribute? You can engage this with the community, and then you can take your school and connect it with the community and with democracy itself. I mean, think about connections between schools and businesses, schools and nonprofits, schools and NGOs. Imagine having the school be a site of public democracy. And if we think about this economically, we have to think if schools are economically sustainable. They might not be. In the United States, we're reaching a point where we're broadly saying American higher education is no longer sustainable. And we don't know what that means now. We don't know where to go next. This is a major crisis. So think about it. Is a primary school economically sustainable? There are models for this. And then ask the students how that works. But also ask if they're economically just. Do we pay our teachers enough? So here is a quick sketch. You know, this slide, I could have just given you this slide and shut up, right? Because this explains everything. Think about changing the curriculum and pedagogy. Think about embracing new literacies, unleashing democracy on education, committing to openness, and considering schools as sites for sustainability. It's not easy. We begin in a situation of a great deal of stress. When I took this photo, the wind was desperately trying to knock me off my feet. So this was a kind of steady cam photo, you know, going back and forth. This is a dark time. This is a time of a great deal of stress. 2016 is darker than 2015 was. So think about the settlement of Iceland. Think about the beginning of any project where the future is challenging, unknown, and difficult. And you can turn it into this. Think about a rich, burgeoning, democratic, and globally oriented society where the schools are the same way. So, I hope we have time for questions and comments. Or applause. Applause is good too. Thank you. Thank you. But questions or comments?
Yes, we do have time. One comment that came early on was about the challenge of the education of adult professionals.
Yes.
I mean, I could see that when you started talking about, you know, it was okay for adults also to play and they need to learn and they need to, you know, it's not that dead serious. This comment comes in, I see a special challenge in education of adult professionals like farmers and foresters, including managed extension services. You have a comment on that?
Yes, we should stop saying adult education, and we should simply say education, because educating children is becoming a smaller and smaller portion of education. I spoke yesterday about the demographics of this, and I think we should simply say education.
Right.
And if we're speaking about primary, secondary school, we should say that's child education or minor education. There are a lot of ways to involve adults of all kinds in education. And I think the atmosphere of crisis and stress that we're experiencing is actually one way. One of the greatest enemies to education is satisfaction. Right? If I don't need to know anymore, I'm fine. I know everything I need to have. But I think the current environment is one that encourages dissatisfaction, and education should be provisioned to respond to that. But also, we have the technologies that make schooling so much easier. So if I'm on a bus or, well, I'd say personally, at home, where I live, we don't have cell phone coverage. And my broadband is kind of like a rusty bicycle going uphill. It's very, very bad. And we raise animals, and we grow food, and we heat with firewood, which I cut, and we build stone walls. And when I'm out there, I have an MP3 player playing podcasts, teaching me languages, teaching me history, teaching me economics. If you're in the forest, if you're on a farm, you can do this. And because of devices which are no longer science fictional, you can push back. You can ask a question. You can interact with a quiz or a game. So I think in many ways, we can educate anybody. Think about the 21st century as the great century of education.
It's more a question of maybe the willingness to be educated, and as you're saying, this might be an excellent time for that. We have a question here in the center.
Very good.
Thank you very much. My name is Grímur Valdimarsson from the Icelandic Ministry of Industries and Innovation. I have two comments and then one question.
Please.
Many years ago, I read a book by Edward O. Wilson called Consilience.
Yes.
That you know, a futurist like you must know, where he was pointing out that our education is getting more and more specialized while the problems of the world are getting more and more complex and have to reach over borders like you were talking about. And actually, it's a very long time since I've heard that angle. My second is that 3 years ago, I believe we got Dr. Julian Cripps to come to Iceland and give us a presentation at the university. He is an Australian science writer and author of the book, The Coming Famine. The food problems of the world are very much on his agenda, and it's an excellent book. And one thing he mentioned that I haven't heard was that what we need is to solve the food problems of the world, and that links, of course, to the bioeconomy and the business of this conference, is he was talking about we need for the 570 million farms around the world tablets that are directly linked to satellites so they can reach every spot on the corner of the earth with information in all the languages about what to plant in every spot and guidance on agricultural systems and an educational tool. Not only can they sort of give your information in writing, but they can talk to you. Could you please comment on this latter one? I found that very, very interesting.
It's a terrific idea, and we should have done it by now. And in many ways, we're doing it through phones instead of tablets. I think especially Android tablets are well suited for that. It's a terrific idea. All the farmers I know are passionately committed to information and education. They're always seeking knowledge They're constantly looking for information about soil, about weather, about seeds, obviously about threats, pests, and so on. So I think in many ways, this is one of the ways to answer your question about farmers, is that this is a population hungry for knowledge and information. But again, remember that the tablet is two-way. The digital literacy is productive as well. So if I'm trying to grow soybeans and I download information about incoming weather or about pests and pesticides, I can also upload pictures of my fields and then accounts of what I'm doing and how this one crop rotation works and why I want this one field to go fallow, and then share that with other people. So when I do that, this other farmer can learn from that experience and we can share all around. That's a collaborative ethos right there. To go back to this book I've heard about but haven't read, Coming Famine, so I'll look for it. Thank you. I can't comment on it because I haven't read it. Consilience is very much in my mind. We have hyper-specialized into many, many different small fragments. I have colleagues who specialize in a 10-year period of 18th century literature. We have to know how to speak to other humans again. And I think interdisciplinarity and consilience are ways forward. Thank you.
You have another question over there?
Hi, my name is Haraldur. I come from a company called Icelandic Startups. Thank you for a really fascinating talk. It's exciting to hear what you think about the future. I was wondering, you talked about the mediums we use to create and to tell stories.
Yes.
And I was wondering, for me, it seems like there's a big problem with incentivizing teachers, and now I'm talking about minor education, as you talked about it, so children's education. How do you incentivize, and how do you incentivize teachers to keep up with new mediums? Already we're behind, and now we're moving into an age of not even virtual reality, but augmented reality or mixed reality.
Yes.
And if we're already behind on what's been happening in the past 15 years, how do you propose to incentivize teachers to keep up and even stay ahead?
That's a terrific question, and I hope I can speak to you afterwards. A couple of quick answers. One, just to make you all feel better. I know when I mentioned that adults should learn programming, and a few of you said, no. Just to make you feel better, no human being can be familiar with all the digital technologies that are out there. No one person. It is too complex. There are too many. It's like asking you to be fluent in 75 languages. There are just way too many, and we have too many other things to do. Kids are very familiar with some technologies, but not all. And often they use them in a very special, narrow way. I find having to teach 18-year-olds how to use Microsoft Word, for example. So I just want to make sure that people feel better, and teachers should feel that way. I mean, you can feel the onrushing tide of technology, but everyone's going to feel that way. In fact, if you want, take a look at the difference between a 5-year-old and a 15-year-old and how they use technology. From apart, they might look pretty advanced, but that 15-year-old is already feeling nervous about that 5-year-old. A key part, I think, is listening to the kids. So watching what they do, what apps they download, what games they play, and involving them in that. I guarantee you, out of a class of, say, 20 students, 1 or 2 of them will be able to teach the teacher something, which is terrific. Teachers always have to be learners. If they're not learning, they've stopped being teachers. We have to model that for students. We have to do that to keep our minds alive. And then the students can teach each other, which is so powerful. We know this from research, that peer teaching is a terrific way for students to learn. So we involve the students, make them producers of knowledge and producers of learning. And on top of this, I put up Twitter here before. We have to think collectively, we have to think collaboratively, and share what we're learning so teachers can learn from other teachers. So someone who's teaching 10-year-olds in New Zealand can talk to a teacher who's teaching 10-year-olds in Iceland or in Finland or in Sweden or on the Faroe Islands, and then they can learn from each other. That's a great way to speed up. And to incentivize them, teachers love working with other teachers. We are a people, and we love having that. The last point is just people don't get into teaching for the money. They don't get into teaching for the, jet-setting lifestyle. They get into teaching because they love teaching. There's an old joke. Primary school teachers go into teaching because they love students. Secondary school teachers go into teaching because they love their subjects, and academics go into teaching because they love themselves. But they do actually love their subjects. And I think looking at technology and saying this is one way to work with students, to reach them, to open their minds and engage their spirits, it just goes from there. There's a whole bunch of people lined up here. I don't know if it's an execution squad or...
We won't tell you. We have another question, right?
Mystery is the key to storytelling.
Yep.
Thank you. Geir Oddsson, Nordic Council of Ministers again. Thanks a lot, Bryan. It was thought-provoking and interesting.
Good.
And I thought it was encouraging.
Good.
In the Nordic countries, we pride ourselves on our democracies, and democratization was one of the things that you mentioned. If you look at the bioeconomy, the subject of this, us coming together here over these 2 days, as a framework for a transformation from towards a more sustainable society. Mm-hmm. That means we need to democratize bioeconomy, or green growth, or whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts about how we can do it?
The short answer is my presentation, because I'm not being sarcastic. Educating a people to think democratically, to think more democratically, is a key way for that. And to combine that with bioeconomy, both green and blue, right? To think about this. A second thing, though, is simply to take information more seriously. So when we're talking about farmers, farming soybeans, for example, to make sure that's open and people can see that, so that someone who is a farmer can track how people are doing when they're fishing cod, can talk to somebody who is raising capital, and they can talk to someone who is an architect and someone who is unemployed. So we can have those conversations happening at once so people are more familiar with each other. I know this is a small population here, and I understand that. My town where I live has about 500 people. I understand how this can work. As opposed to the giant countries of, say, Sweden or Norway, these titans of population, right? But it's important to have that familiarity and that connection. And then to be able to think together and say that we can work these ways together. One problem is, to go back to consilience, we have a lot of complexity in the situation. So, for example, were you here yesterday? Our speaker, Dr. Lena, yes. She was fantastic. And you think about the details that she presented. Holy cow, this took a lot of time. I wanted to pause her a few times. Tell me more about insects and protein. Or rerun that term again. We have to make sure our experts can communicate, like she did, and do more and more of that. That way we can actually democratically engage, because you can't engage with something that you don't understand. Good question.
Thank you so much, Bryan Alexander. We have to move forward. Thank you for this discussion. And hopefully you can keep on discussing this during the coffee break.
My pleasure. Thank you all.
Absolutely. Thank you.